The morning Kayla Merritt said he was moving into a cave, the town of Silver Ridge went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Men stopped chewing. Women paused mid-step. Even the horses tied outside Jensen's general store lifted their heads, as if they had heard something unnatural. One of the materials became home when we saw the feathered jet under it. Kayla stood there with his coat unbuttoned, autumn wind cutting through the street, and said it again so there would be no mistake. He was building his winter shelter inside Whitestone Cave. Silver Ridge sat hard against the mountains of Montana Territory, a place where winters did not forgive mistakes. By October of 1886, everyone knew the rules. You built above ground. You stacked wood higher than your roofline. You sealed every crack with mud and moss. And you prayed the fire lasted longer than the cold. A cave was not a home. It was where animals hid. It was where water collected. It was where men went when they had nowhere else to go. The town's master builder, Harold Sutherland, laughed first. He was a thick-shouldered man with gray in his beard and 19 winters of experience stamped into his hands. He said the cave would sweat moisture and rot Kayla's bedding. He said the cold would crawl down the stone walls and steal the heat from Kayla's bones while he slept. He said the cave would flood come spring and trap him like an animal in a hole. People nodded because Harold had earned their trust, one cabin at a time. The mayor called it an insult to proper pioneering. The pastor said it was unnatural to live underground. Neighbors who once shared meals with Kayla crossed the street to avoid him. By the end of the week, Silver Ridge had decided something important. Kayla Merritt had lost his mind. Kayla did not argue. He did not raise his voice or try to prove anyone wrong. He was not a dreamer or a man chasing attention. He was 34 years old and had spent 7 winters working as a railroad carpenter across the territory. He had seen men freeze in their sleep. He had watched families burn through wood faster than they could split it. And he knew, with a quiet certainty, that this winter would be worse. Every fall in Silver Ridge followed the same pattern. Wagons groaned under the weight of firewood. Children dragged moss and clay to stuff into cracks. Women stitched extra layers into blankets and buffalo hides. Still, by January, ice formed on the inside of cabin walls. The fires fought in all directions at once. Heat bled out through 4 walls, a roof, and a floor raised above frozen ground. No matter how hard people worked, the cold always found a way in. The winter before, Kayla had watched a family of 5 nearly die when a 3-week cold snap burned through their entire wood supply. The father lost fingers to frostbite. 2 children coughed blood by spring. That was when Kayla stopped thinking like everyone else. Whitestone Cave sat a quarter-mile east of town, carved into a limestone hill by water older than memory. The entrance faced south, shielded from the worst winds that tore down from the northwest. The cave ran deep into the earth, wide enough to stand in, tall enough to breathe. Hunters used it to dress game. Children dared each other to step inside and run back out screaming. Nobody saw it as shelter. Kayla did. He saw 3 walls and a roof already built, wrapped in earth that held steady warmth even when the air turned deadly. He remembered working inside railroad tunnels in winter, sweating while the world above froze solid. Underground, the temperature did not swing wildly. It stayed calm. It stayed stable. Nature did half the work for you if you let it. By late September, Kayla began hauling lumber toward the cave. He worked alone. By mid-October, people stopped him in the street to ask if the rumors were true. He nodded and kept walking. By the time the first snow dusted the valley, Silver Ridge was openly mocking him. What Kayla built looked wrong to anyone raised on frontier rules. He did not try to tame the cave. He worked with it. He sealed the entrance with 2 walls instead of 1, packing dry grass and shavings between them to trap heat. He built the doorway so the wind could not rush straight inside. He placed his stove against the limestone itself, turning the stone into something that held warmth instead of stealing it. Inside, he raised the floor slightly and filled the space beneath with river stones. Cold air sank away from where he slept. Warmth stayed where it was needed. He cut a narrow vent through the ceiling so smoke and stale air could rise naturally. Nothing about the design fought the cold head-on. It redirected it, slowed it, starved it of openings. From the outside, it looked like a man giving up. From the inside, it felt solid. Silver Ridge never saw that part. They saw a man disappear into the earth as winter closed in. By November, Kayla stopped eating at the boarding house. He bought supplies early in the morning to avoid whispers. Children laughed when he passed. Women shook their heads. Men placed bets on how long it would take before he came crawling back, begging for space by someone's fire. When the first real snow fell in early December, nobody checked on him. They assumed the lesson would come soon enough. January arrived like a warning bell. Temperatures dropped fast and stayed there. Fires burned day and night. By mid-month, wood piles shrank at a worrying pace. Then, on January 19th, the wind rose and did not stop. The blizzard came hard and fast. Snow fell thick enough to erase the road in hours. By nightfall, 18 inches covered the valley. The temperature slid toward zero. Men shoveled paths to their woodsheds every few hours just to keep them reachable. Children were pulled inside. The town hunkered down and waited, believing this was just another storm. It was not. The next day brought more snow and stronger wind. Drifts swallowed windows. Doors froze shut. Fires burned hotter, faster. By the third day, the temperature plunged well below zero. Wind screamed through every gap in every wall. Cabins became cold boxes with a fire trapped inside, losing heat as fast as it was made. By the fifth day, fear settled in. Wood ran low. Furniture cracked and burned. Families crowded around stoves, leaving the rest of their homes to ice. Frost crept along walls and ceilings. Children slept with hats pulled low, breath puffing in the dark. By the sixth day, Silver Ridge was in trouble. The cold pressed inward without mercy. 2 elderly residents lost feeling in their hands without ever stepping outside. Several families abandoned their cabins and packed into the town hall, hoping shared heat would save them. It barely did. No one had seen Kayla Merritt since the storm began. Harold Sutherland stood in his own cabin, staring at ice thickening on the north wall, and thought about the cave. He pushed the thought away. If Kayla was dead, it was his own doing. Still, something about it sat wrong in Harold's chest. The blizzard raged on for 9 days. When the wind finally died and the sky cleared, Silver Ridge dug itself out slowly, counting losses and checking on neighbors. On the morning after the storm broke, Deputy Marshal Richard Graves volunteered to walk out to Whitestone Cave. He said it was his duty. He did not say he had worked alongside Kayla years before and could not stand the thought of leaving him there alone. Graves pushed through waist-deep drifts, the cave nearly buried by snow. When he reached the entrance, he had to dig to find the door. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder, calling Kayla's name. Then, from inside the cave, came the sound of movement. The door opened, warm air rolled out into the frozen morning, and Kayla Merritt stood there, alive. Deputy Marshal Richard Graves forgot how to speak. He stood in the snow with his coat stiff from ice, staring at Kayla Merritt as if he were looking at a ghost that had learned to breathe. Kayla wore no coat. His sleeves were rolled to the forearms. Steam drifted lazily from the cave behind him, warm and steady, like the breath of a living thing. Graves stepped forward without thinking. The cold had numbed his legs, but the air spilling from the cave touched his face and felt almost gentle. Kayla motioned him inside and closed the door behind them. The wind vanished. The screaming cold disappeared, as if someone had shut it out of the world. Inside, Graves stopped again. The cave was not dark or damp or desperate. It was calm. A small fire burned in a cast-iron stove, not roaring, just steady. A thermometer hung from the limestone wall, the red line resting just above 50 degrees. Graves pulled off his gloves, then his coat, sweat already forming along his spine. Outside it was 6 below zero. Kayla handed him a tin cup filled with coffee. It was hot. Graves wrapped his hands around it, feeling life return to his fingers. He looked around slowly, dry bedding stacked neatly against one wall, Firewood piled higher than his shoulder barely touched. Clothes hung from pegs, clean and warm. The stone walls were dry. There was no smell of mold, no dripping water, no frost. "You been like this the whole time?" Graves finally said. Kayla nodded. "More or less." Temperature never dropped below 48, never went above 56. Graves did the math in his head and felt something twist in his gut. His own family had slept fully dressed for 9 nights, taking turns tending the fire. They had burned nearly 3 cords of wood and still woken with ice on the walls. Kayla had been reading books. Graves stayed for nearly an hour. Kayla explained what he had built, not like a man bragging, but like a man describing a tool. He talked about stone holding heat, about earth blocking the wind, about air moving the way it wanted if you gave it the right path. It all sounded simple when Kayla said it, too simple to ignore. When Graves finally stepped back into the cold, his head was full and his chest felt tight. He went straight to town. By noon, word had spread. By afternoon, men were standing outside Whitestone Cave, stamping their feet, waiting their turn. No one laughed now. No one whispered. One by one, they stepped inside and came back out with wide eyes and quiet voices. Harold Sutherland arrived the next morning with his own thermometer. He said nothing when he read it. He walked the cave slowly, touching the stone behind the stove, running his hand along the dry walls, checking the vent. He counted the firewood. He asked Kayla how often he fed the stove and wrote the answers down. Outside, a crowd waited in the snow. Harold came out last. His face looked older somehow. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "It works," he said. The word hit the crowd harder than any shout. Harold did not explain right away. He did not need to. The proof stood behind him, warm and solid, while the town shivered. That night, men went home and looked at their cabins differently. They felt the drafts they had ignored for years. They watched heat vanish into the walls. They remembered how close they had come to running out of wood. Pride shifted into something else, something closer to fear. Within days, people were asking Kayla questions, real questions. How deep should a structure go? How thick should a wall be? How to stop moisture? How to vent smoke without losing heat? Kayla answered everyone. He sketched designs on scraps of paper and slate. He explained without mocking anyone. He did not say he had been right. He only said what had worked. The mayor asked him to speak at an informal meeting. Kayla stood in the boarding house with a dozen tired faces watching him, and talked about heat loss and shelter like a man talking about rain. Harold stood beside him and listened. Plans began forming before winter even ended. A farmer 2 miles out marked a south-facing hill. A prospector asked about modifying an old mine entrance. Families talked about digging partway into slopes and banking earth against their cabins. The idea spread because it made sense, not because anyone wanted to admit they had been wrong. Spring came slow that year. When the thaw arrived, Whitestone Cave did not flood. The ground around it drained naturally. Kayla's shelter stood dry and unchanged, just as he said it would. By the following winter, Silver Ridge looked different. New structures hugged hillsides. Old cabins wore heavy earth banks along their north walls. Wood piles stayed larger. Fires burned less frantic. Children slept warmer. Kayla Merritt was no longer avoided. He was invited. He ate at tables that had once turned him away. People listened when he spoke, but the mountains were watching, and winters in Montana never repeated themselves the same way twice. 2 years later, another storm began to build beyond the ridgeline, slower and heavier than the last. Snow fell early and did not stop. They seemed imitated. The wind returned angrier than before, and Silver Ridge would soon learn whether Kayla's ideas had been understood or merely copied, because this time the cold would stay longer. The second great storm did not announce itself the way the first one had. There was no sudden fury, no screaming wind on the first night. It crept in quietly in early January of 1889, laying snow over Silver Ridge like a heavy blanket that never lifted. The temperature dropped slowly day by day until the cold settled deep into the ground and refused to leave. By the fourth day, People understood this storm was different. The sky stayed gray. Snow fell without pause. The wind came and went, not in bursts, but in long, steady breaths that shaped drifts taller than fences. Roads vanished. The telegraph lines snapped under ice. Silver Ridge was cut off. But this time, panic did not arrive with the cold. Families stayed in their homes. Fires burned low and steady instead of roaring. Woodpiles shrank, but not with the same frightening speed. The changes Kayla Merritt had spoken about were no longer ideas. They were walls, floors, and earth packed tight against cabins. In homes that had been partly dug into hillsides, the air stayed calm. Stone floors held warmth long after fires dimmed. Drafts that once whistled through cracks were gone. Mothers stopped waking children every hour to check fingers and toes. Men slept longer stretches without rising to feed the stove. Still, the storm pressed on. By the 7th day, temperatures fell below 30 under zero and stayed there. The snow reached the eaves of some cabins. Town hall filled again, but this time it was with people sharing meals and warmth, not refugees fleeing frozen homes. There were no bets about survival, only quiet endurance. Kayla moved through town each day, checking vents, clearing snow from entrances, making sure air still flowed where it needed to. He worked without authority, without title. People let him in anyway. They listened when he told them to move a stove 6 inches closer to stone, or to block a low draft near the floor. Harold Sutherland followed him more than once, watching closely. The man who had once dismissed the cave as a tomb now asked questions like a student. He measured, he tested, he learned. On the 10th day, the storm finally showed its teeth. The wind returned in full force, screaming down from the mountains, driving snow hard enough to sting through wool. One old cabin on the edge of town, never modified, began to fail. Its roof sagged under weight. The fire could not keep up. Frost climbed the walls in sheets. Kayla was there before dawn with 3 other men. They dug through drifts and pulled the family out just before the roof gave way. They brought them into an earth-banked home nearby. The temperature difference hit like a wall. The children stopped shivering within minutes. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. If the town had not changed after the first blizzard, this one would have broken them. The storm lasted 13 days. When it finally loosened its grip, Silver Ridge emerged battered but standing. There were no deaths from cold, no lost children, no families burned out of their homes. Wood supplies were low, but not gone. The town had endured. Word traveled outward once the roads reopened. Travelers stopped to ask questions. Homesteaders listened closely. What started as a cave became a method. What began as mockery became practice. Kayla never claimed credit. When asked why he had chosen the cave in the first place, he gave the same answer every time. He said the earth had already solved the problem. He had only noticed. Years passed. Silver Ridge grew. Frame houses replaced some cabins. Coal stoves arrived. The cave stayed quiet on the hillside, its entrance weathered but solid. Children who once laughed at it now brought their own children to see where the town learned how to survive. Harold Sutherland retired with a different reputation than he expected. He was no longer remembered only for what he built, but for what he changed his mind about. He often said the hardest thing he ever did was admit the cold did not care how long you had been building. Kayla Merritt stayed in Silver Ridge until his hair went gray. He never married. He never left. In winter, smoke still rose from Whitestone Cave, slow and steady. In summer, the place stayed cool and quiet. When he died, the town buried him on the hill above the cave. The marker was simple: no titles, no praise, just his name and the years he lived. Long after, travelers still spoke of Silver Ridge, not as the town that froze, but as the town that learned. They said there was a winter when pride nearly killed everyone, and a man who chose a different way showed them how to live. The cave remained, not as a shelter anymore, but as a lesson carved into stone. Sometimes the smartest answer does not look brave. Sometimes it looks like retreat. Until the storm comes up,